Hi everyone, my name is Janelle John and I'm presenting on About Behaviorism, B.F. Skinner's Chapter 9, Knowing. Skinner introduces this chapter by making connection between knowledge and behavior. It is referenced in the book that behavior exists only when it is being executed on a physiological system. This system is changed when behavior was acquired, and it is a changed system which is possessed. Therefore, knowledge is possessed as a repertoire in this sense. In this next section, Kinds of Knowing, Skinner begins this chapter by defining the meaning of to know. And he defines it as a contact with or to be intimate with. So Skinner references examples of a person's know as sin, beauty, or sorrow. Skinner says that we are able to do something such as open a window or solve a problem. So Skinner gave an example: if we can recite a poem or play a piece of music without reading it, we are said to know it by heart. Skinner also refers to the fact that we know about things such as mathematics beyond having contact with the field, but also by possessing various forms of behavior with respect to them. So, which brings us to Skinner's next point, that these forms of knowing depends on previous exposure to contingencies of reinforcement. This special kind of knowledge relates to instructions, directions, rules, and laws. Skinner describes the difference between knowledge that allows a person to describe contingencies and knowledge that identify behavior that is shaped by contingencies. In this next section, does knowledge come from experience? John Locke and British empirics was referenced as highlighting simple contacts with stimulating environment. Skinner references Chapter 5, Information on Perceiving, and the introduction of elements of the belief and will into empirical position. Knowledge of the world, on the other hand, is more than contact with a given setting. It is a result of contingencies of reinforcement, and the setting is a part of it. Skinner finishes off this section by stating that the experience of which knowledge is derived consists of full contingencies. In this next section, knowledge as power and contemplation covers knowledge as action, or at very least a rule of action which makes it powerful. Francis Bacon is referenced in this section for rejecting the system of doctrine and the way of life based on Aristotelian logic, and it insists of knowing for the sake of knowing. Skinner also highlights operant behavior as the exercise of power and the effect on the environment. Skinner also describes the use of to know to mean being under control, of which it is not only determined of behavior. Chapter 7, Thinking, is also referenced for the distinction between thinking and knowing. So thinking is typically used to regard a tentative hypothesis, and knowing is typically used to regard proven cases. Contemplative knowledge is described in this chapter as connected to verbal behavior, and with the fact that it is the listener rather than the speaker who takes action. Skinner described verbal behavior as having the principal role in contemplative knowledge. It is also identified that the adaptive for automatic reinforcement. In the understanding section, Skinner describes understanding as having understanding of the why, which includes controlling variables about circumstances. There are different variables that Skinner describes that we come to understand. Skinner states that understanding requires some sort of form of knowing the reason. Skinner uses a reference of a switch and an apparatus into operation. One may come to understand by analyzing previous contingencies. Skinner describes having a deeper understanding of a rule in the sense through exposure to the natural contingency it describes. He states that the understanding gained by moving from rule governed to contingency shaped behavior is usually reinforcing, in part because the reinforcer in the later case are less likely to contrive and hence less likely to work in instance of others. Skinner begins knowing as processing information with the information theory. The information theory is an approach of transmitted signals and is applied to verbal behavior through sound streams of speech between speakers and listeners. Information is also used in various ways to describe individual behavior. Skinner describes the mental process of storing and retrieving memory as a transmission of information. The example Skinner describes stored memories or data structure as coded information that starts as input but progressively changes until it becomes a predisposition to act. Skinner then describes operant analysis as a form of knowledge information that can be treated more effectively as a behavior repertoire. Lastly, Skinner describes the information theory as a sophisticated version of the copy theory. In this section, the personal knowledge of the scientist, Skinner distinguishes scientific knowledge between what is known by scientists and what does knowing mean. Skinner makes reference to the important facts of law of science, our description of the world as prevailing contingencies of reinforcement. The rule govern behavior from behavior generates by direct exposure to contingencies and further tested for validity, proof, practices, and other elements of the scientific method. Michael Polanyi and Percy Bridgman insist that science is unavoidably personal. Bridgman also describes that science is describing things as they seem, which seems like two contradicting ideas, but okay. The last section of knowing addressed the IMUS as the moral climate or class consciousness and the spirit of times are other intellectual possessions of part of knowledge as well as account for a large pattern of behavior characteristics. Skinner describes conflict between practicality and rationality between contingencies of history and ideas to show the development of human thought. Skinner connects this notion with an example of romanticism, which leads to classicism and vice versa. But because the practices characteristics of one ism eventually produces conditions under different patterns of behavior is generated and is for the time maintained. So I know I'm a little short on the video, but these are the two questions that I want to pose to the class. Can you please provide an example of how you use know as being under control in your personal life? And the hint for answering this question is on slide 5 and page 154 of the book that we are reading. And the next question, can you describe information theory to specific types of behavior? And I included the hints for different types of behaviors that would use these different information theory. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.